All right, welcome once again. We're going to go ahead and get into our study for today. And we're going to be continuing where we left off in Revelation chapter 13 in what I'm going to call the Mark of the Beast Part 2. Now, we have studied as we have gone through Daniel, and we have seen different times that God predicts the nations or the kingdoms that were to arise in Daniel's time. We saw that Babylon was a subject of prophecy, but not just Babylon. We saw that it went and continued to Babylon and Medo-Persia and Greece and Rome. But all of those nations, all of those empires seem like a long time ago, don't they? And so the question comes to us, does God have prophecies for us today? Or was it only for back in Daniel's day and times like that? And I believe that God has prophecies for us today as well. And we're going to be asking a specific question today. Is our country, do we find our country, the United States of America, do we find this in Bible prophecy? We know of our historic documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and we know these historic liberties that these guarantee for us. But another question, a secondary question we're going to be looking at is, will these historic liberties or these historic freedoms, will they be challenged in our time? And we're turning to the book of Revelation, but before we go to Revelation chapter 13, I want to go back to an Old Testament story. An Old Testament story, no doubt, that you are familiar with. It is one of the grand stories of the Old Testament. There was a man from the mountains of Gilead that was given a commission to go and to tell a wicked king of judgments that were coming. And so Elijah the Tishbite leaves his little home in the mountains. And as he leaves this little home in the mountains, he goes before wicked King Ahab with a message. And the message that he has is, there will be no dew nor rain according to my word. And quickly he turns, and as he turns, he goes to where Ahab cannot find him, which happens to be by the brook Cherith. God sends the ravens with food to him there at the brook Cherith. And I think there's a very important principle there. God promises to take care of us if we're following in his way. And I'm thankful that we can trust in God to provide for our needs even when it seems impossible. For Elijah, he knew that he had to hide. He couldn't go back to his home because the soldiers of Ahab would quickly be at his house. And so he had to go wherever God directed him, which happened to be the brook Cherith, but he had no cupboards of food. There were no grocery stores. There were not even gardens that you could grow, most likely, beside the brook Cherith. How was he going to be provided for? If we put God first, God will provide for us. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6, verse 33, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you." God has promised to provide for us if we are faithful to him. David said, Psalm 37, "I've been young, but now am old, yet have I not seen the righteous forsaken, nor his seed begging bread." We can trust in God. And Elijah trusted in God. Now, it wasn't easy. He had to step out in faith. He had to move and do what God had called him to do. But Elijah did that, and God took care of them. Now, some have asked, where did those ravens bring their food from? Well, we don't know, but there is something that we have in the Bible. It mentions Jezebel's table. And some have suggested that those ravens went right to Jezebel's table, took the food off Jezebel's table, and took it to her arch enemy, to Elijah there. But as Elijah is there, 1 year goes by, 2 years go by. We don't know the exact amount of time that he's at the brook Cherith. But things begin to change. What happens if there's no dew nor rain? The grass dries up. How well do your gardens grow if there's no dew nor rain? What happens to the agricultural product of the country? What about the sheep and the cattle and the goats? Where do they find their food if there is no rain? And pretty soon, this drought begins to affect Elijah as well. God had led him to the brook Cherith. But as God led him to the brook Cherith, he was now leading him on somewhere else. Sometimes God leads us one way, and he continues leading us. And God was directing Elijah way up to the north. And as he is directing him to the north, he goes to a widow of Zarephath. And once again, there's a test. And when we look at this test, Elijah comes and he says, "Please, can you give me a little bit of water?" Well, that is a request that is rarely denied in the Middle East. And then he says, "But also, can you make a little cake of bread for me?" And she says, "You don't understand." Found in 1 Kings chapter 17. "You don't understand. I am gathering sticks, and I have a little bit of flour. And I am going to make one cake for my son and I. We are going to eat it, and then we are going to die." She sounds pretty distraught, doesn't she? And Elijah says, "Go and do as you have said, but make the cake first for me." Was Elijah being selfish? No, it was a demonstration. She knew, or apparently Elijah told her, or somehow or another she got the idea, that Elijah was a prophet of God. And God was asking her to put God first and promising that he would provide. Sure enough, the next morning, I can imagine the little boy going to the barrel to see if there's any food for the day. And as he looks in, "Oh, there's a little bit of flour. I thought you used it all yesterday, Mommy." "I did." "Well, there's a little more. Let's get it." "Oh, there's just a few drops of oil in here. We can make our cakes for today, our little loaves, and we can eat for today. But it's all gone." The next morning, little boy comes, peeks in. There's still flour there. And the next, and the next. For however long Elijah was there, God provided for this woman. Why? Because she put God first. When we put God first, he promises to provide. But the time came when God spoke to Elijah and said, "Go show yourself to King Ahab." For 3.5 years, there had been no drought, no rain, no dew. Now, what happens to an agricultural society if for 3.5 years there's no drought? I keep saying no drought. There was plenty of drought, but there was no rain. What happens to their products? Their economy went to zero. They had no income for 3 years. Not only that, they had no income, they had no food. We don't know how they were provided for. I was listening to a book recently of a famine in Malawi about 20 years ago, something like that. And the description of the drought came and it wrecked their crop, and they had just a little bit of food, and they had to go to 2 meals a day, and then 1 meal a day, and then start mixing non-food items basically with the little food to try to extend it. And it kept going where they were selling even their future crops in hope that they could make it through just a little bit longer. Terrible. And God says to Elijah, go show yourself to Ahab. Elijah presents himself to Ahab and says, all right, now there's going to be a challenge. Meet me on top of Mount Carmel and bring all those prophets and priests of Baal with you, who you claim send the water, send the rain and the sun. And Elijah proposes this challenge. Let's both make altars, and whoever God kindles fire on the altar without a match, without flint, without a stone, without anything like that, then that is the true God. The priests and prophets of Baal dance around the altar, cut themselves, cry out, scream, do multiple gyrations and whatever else, attempting to call down fire from heaven through their god, Baal. After exhausting themselves, after watching them for hours, Elijah says, come here. Let's repair the altar of God. They had to restore the worship of God. It had been forgotten. Let's repair the altar of God. Let's repair the worship of God. And then Elijah says, all right, here's the altar. Here's our sacrifice. But we need to make this very clear. Go down to the Mediterranean, gather up some water, buckets and barrels of water, and bring it up here to Mount Carmel. And they do it, and he says, dump the water on. They dump it on. Do it again. The water's running everywhere. Do it again. Totally waterlogged, soaked, wood, sacrifice, and everything. Have you ever tried to start a fire with wet wood? And then Elijah begins to pray. A simple, short prayer. And as he prays, fire comes down from heaven and consumes the sacrifice, the wood on the altar, the very stones of the altar. And the people say, the Lord, He is God. Now, this Old Testament story is a fascinating story. And there's connections to the chapter that we're looking at today in Revelation chapter 13. Notice Revelation 13, verse 13. Notice what it says about this power that is predicted in the last days. It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in front of the people. This power brings down fire from heaven. But not only does it bring down fire from heaven, this is not God's true fire that comes down from heaven. Why? Because it leads to the enforcement of the mark of the beast. And so we need to understand and see if we can figure out who this power is and what this power is going to do. Revelation chapter 13. Revelation chapter 13, and let's begin in verse 11. Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. Notice what it says here, that here is this beast coming up out of the earth, two horns like a lamb, and spoke like a dragon. Now, I want to notice something, first of all. It comes up for the time period it comes up from. And notice, let's just back up a little bit. Let's read verses 9 and 10. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. He who leads into captivity shall go into captivity. He who kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and faith of the saints. So notice here we have this beast, this first beast that we studied about last night, this church-state combination, this papal power, and it received a deadly wound. And you remember when it received its deadly wound, it was to continue for 42 months from about 538 to 1798 in persecution. 1798, Napoleon's general Berthier comes in and takes captive the Pope and the papal lands. And it receives a deadly wound. It went into captivity, It had taken many into captivity. It was killed with the sword, so to speak. It had killed many with the sword. And so it's right around 1798, and that's when we read here in verse 11, "Then I saw another beast." So this is going to be, what is a beast in Bible prophecy? We've already seen this before. A beast is a kingdom or a nation, right? And so here is another power coming up around 1798. So this lamb-like beast, or this beast with lamb-like horns would be a better way to put it, arises around 1798. So we're going to look at 5 points, and as we look at these 5 points, I believe we're going to be able to identify this power and then see if we can figure out, according to prophecy, what this power will be doing. But let's look at another point, and all these points are going to be coming right from Revelation chapter 13 and verse 11, which we just read. It says, "I saw another beast," and where was this other beast? Where was it rising up out of? The earth, wasn't it? Now this is unique. This is different. What is unique and what is different about it? All the other beasts that we have seen so far arise out of the water. In Daniel chapter 7, this lion, this bear, this leopard, this dreadful and terrible beast, all of them come up out of the great sea. This first beast that we read in Revelation 13 about last night, it also arises from the sea. But this beast in Revelation 13 verse 11 is not arising from the sea. It is arising from somewhere else. Where is this second beast of Revelation 13 arising from? It's arising from the earth. Now, Bible prophecy tells us what the sea represents, and we can understand then what the earth represents. Why? Because the earth is the opposite of the sea, right? If it's not rising up out of the sea, if it's rising up out of the earth, it's arising from something different from the sea. Now, we've read this verse already, but let's notice it again. Revelation chapter 17 and verse 15. "Then he said to me, the waters which you saw, where the harlot sits, are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues." So what does water represent in Bible prophecy here? Lots of people, right? Peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. And when we look at these other beasts, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, they came up from primarily the Middle East area and Europe, that area, which is still largely populated, not the desert always, but we're talking about that as the cradle of the Fertile Crescent and things like that. And so this second beast does not come up out of the sea. It's coming up out of the earth. The sea represents lots of people, peoples, multitudes, and tongues. So the earth is going to represent the opposite of that, which would be not very many people, right? Or a sparsely populated area. This new beast, this new power, comes up out of the earth, or we could say from a sparsely populated area. So, point number 2. Number 1 rises around 1798. Number 2 arises from a sparsely populated area. Now, let's keep moving on. Let's see if we can find a third point from Revelation chapter 13 and verse 11. Notice it says, "And I saw another beast rising." Now, what does rising? That Greek word is anabino. It's the same word that is used in reference to the sower sowing the seed. The seed would rise, or anabino, it would spring up, it would grow up. It's a word that's used to refer to plants growing. Now, if you plant a garden, do you harvest it overnight? That was a few years ago, a garden we had in Washington. But, if you plant a garden, it takes some time, doesn't it? We wish that we could plant it today and that it would harvest tomorrow, right? That's what we wish it would happen. But it takes all season, and if you're going to plant fruit trees, it takes years, doesn't it? And so a garden slowly rises or slowly grows. And so this was going to be a power that was going to be slowly growing to power. Slowly growing to power. Around 1798, from a sparsely populated area that was going to be slowly growing to power. Now I want to notice another aspect here. This beast power, it says, I saw another beast rising up out of the earth, and it had 2 horns. But what I want to notice is what is lacking on these horns. There are no crowns on these horns, right? It has 2 horns like a lamb, but there are no crowns on the horns of this second beast. The first beast had many crowns. Who wears a crown? Kings wear crowns. I don't wear a crown, but kings wear crowns, right? Or queens. Monarchy wears crowns. And so when we look at it, the realizing that this second beast was going to be without a king. So we might say that it was going to be a nation without a king. Beast arising around 1798 from a sparsely populated area, slowly growing to power, and it was going to be a nation, a power that was arising without a king. Now I want to look at that one last point. It says it had 2 horns like, what does it say? Like a lamb, doesn't it? 2 horns like a lamb. Now what is that referring to? Revelation uses the word lamb more than any other book in the New Testament. In fact, in the book of Revelation, lamb is used 27 times. All the other 26 times, it refers to Jesus. A lamb. Of course, a lamb we think of as gentle and innocent and docile. We think of all those. But Jesus is the Lamb of God, isn't he? And so I would suggest that because it had 2 horns like a lamb, I would suggest that this is a power that is based on Christ-like principles. Based on Christ-like principles. What are Christ-like principles? 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 17 says, now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is, what does it say? Liberty, right? Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Does Jesus want to give liberty and freedom? Absolutely he does, doesn't he? He says, a prophecy of him in Isaiah chapter 61 talks about how he's going to proclaim liberty to the captives, the opening of the prison doors, and all of these type of things. Jesus is interested in helping the oppressed, and he wants to give liberty, but not just liberty, he wants to give freedom as well. Famous verse in John chapter 8, verse 32 says, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you, what does it say? Free. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Jesus wants to set us free, doesn't he? Jesus wants to give us freedom. He wants to give us liberty. He wants to set us free. What does he want to set us free from? We continue reading, and it says, they say, oh, we've never been in bondage to anyone. This is what the Jews say. And Jesus says, he that commits sin is a slave of sin. Oh, and it says, if the Son will make you free, you shall be free indeed. Jesus wants to set us free from the power of sin. Aren't you thankful about that? It doesn't matter how hard that habit is to break, Jesus is stronger, isn't he? It doesn't matter how long we've been chained by the chains of sin, Jesus can break those chains. It doesn't matter what habit has bound us, Jesus can set us free. He wants to give us freedom. He wants to give us liberty. He wants to set us free. He wants to develop his characteristics in our lives. But when we look at this power, lamb-like horns, based on Christ-like principles, liberty and freedom. Now, there's a principle that Jesus gave, and as I look at the life of Jesus, from a secular perspective, I believe that this is perhaps one of the greatest teachings, one of the greatest principles that Jesus gave. Now, from a biblical Christian perspective, every word from Jesus is important, and there's profound truths for us. But as far as something that affects society as a whole, this was an amazing change from what the norm was in Jesus' day. Jesus says in John chapter 22, Matthew chapter 22, the Jews come to him and they're trying to trick him, and they say, well, is it lawful to pay taxes or not? Nobody likes taxes, right? And so he says, well, give me a coin. Okay, well, why do you want a coin? Well, here's a coin. And he looks at this coin and he says, whose image and superscription is on this coin? And this is what they say, verse 21. They said to him, Caesar's. And he said to them, render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. What does he say? He says, render to Caesar what is Caesar, and to God's what is God's. What is he saying? We have a duty to Caesar, but we have a duty to God, and that duty to God is even higher than our duty to Caesar. But he's showing that there's a separation. Today, in our modern terminology, we refer to it as a separation of church and state. That there's an obligation that we have to God, and there's an obligation that we have to the state. And this was a principle that goes all the way back to Jesus' teaching. Now, when Jesus said that, almost every state in existence, and as far as I know that perhaps had existed, everyone combined religion and government together. But Jesus said, no, you have an obligation to Caesar. Render to Caesar what is Caesar's. But you have an obligation to God what is God's. Render therefore to God what is God's. And there's a distinction between the two, a separation between church and state. And so when we look at that, we see that this power was going to be giving liberty and freedom, lamb-like, and based on these Christ-like principles. Now, nation, new nation, arising around 1798 from a sparsely populated area that was going to slowly grow to power, was going to be a nation without a king, and was going to be based on the principles of liberty and freedom. Is there a nation that fits those characteristics that we look at? What is the only nation that fits this description? As I look around, the only nation that I see that fits that description is, of course, the United States. Promising liberty and freedom. We know the story. We know how the pilgrims came here seeking freedom of worship. They actually did not give it, but they wanted it for themselves. And how these principles and these ideas became enshrined in our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the United States, was it arising around 1798? Sure. Declaration of Independence signed 1776. Constitution, something like 1789. New power right at this time, right when this deadly wound was being inflicted. Slowly growing to power. You know, not in my lifetime, but some of you might be able to remember when we got two more stars on our flag. Hawaii and Alaska became states. What was it, 1959, I think? Slowly grew through purchases. Louisiana purchase, Gadsden purchase, purchasing of Alaska. From a sparsely populated area, compared to Europe and the Old World, the United States is still sparsely populated. If you've ever traveled there in Europe, I've been there a couple times, but the houses are very close together. I was with a young man one time from Netherlands, and we were driving from Nebraska back to Washington. Now, if you've ever driven from Nebraska through Wyoming and on the interstate there, you know it's a fairly desolate area. And we'd been driving for some hours, I don't remember how long, and he turned and he looked at me and said, "We've driven the whole distance of the Netherlands and not seen one house the whole time." Still, somewhat of a sparsely populated area. Without a king, it was an experiment to have a nation without a king, based on liberty and freedom. I believe that the United States fits this description, and no other nation or power fits this description. But there's some other things we need to look at. We might like that description up to that point, but we need to look at a little bit more. Notice Revelation 13, verse 11. There's an aspect that we haven't looked at yet. It says, Then I saw another beast rising up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb, and what does it say? Spoke like a dragon. Two horns like a lamb, and spoke like a dragon. What does that mean? Spoke like a dragon. Well, we've seen the dragon before, haven't we? We've seen the dragon in Revelation chapter 12. We've seen the dragon in Revelation chapter 13. The dragon was Satan and pagan Rome through which he was working during that time. And so here, this beast that's coming up out of the earth, slowly growing to power, has two horns like a lamb, and now it says it's going to speak like a dragon. Actually, it doesn't just say it's going to speak like a dragon. It said it spoke like a dragon. It was based on Christ-like principles, but yet it was speaking, in the past even, like a dragon. Now, if you saw this cute little lamb out in the field, and you came up to this cute little lamb and you wanted to pet it, and you came down to pet it, and it roared at you like a dragon, would you be surprised? Absolutely, right? Now, we talked about some of these founding documents, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The United States was based on the principles of freedom and liberty. But it wasn't based on the principles of freedom and liberty for everyone, unfortunately. You can read in these founding documents, and it talks about the slaves being 3/5 of a person, claiming to give liberty and freedom, but yet not giving it to everyone. Speaking like a dragon. If you talk to the Native American people that were here, you would see that while professing liberty and freedom, speaking like a dragon. But this prophecy continues. Let's read verse 12. Revelation chapter 13, verse 12. And he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence, and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. Notice what we see. It says that this power is going to arise with the professions of liberty and freedom, but yet was going to be speaking like a dragon. And then it says it was going to exercise all the authority of the first beast before it. This first beast was worldwide. It says that, verse 7 of this first beast, it says, and authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. Prophecy is predicting this power would grow in authority, and it would exercise the authority of the first beast, but it would cause the world, it would cause those that dwell in it, the earth, to worship the first beast whose deadly wound was healed. How is it going to do that? Well, let's see if we can put the pieces together a little bit. Remember back in Elijah's day, why were there judgments that came upon Elijah? Or not upon Elijah, but upon the people in Elijah's day? Because of their sins. They had departed from God's commandments. In fact, you see in 1 Kings chapter 18, when Elijah is there on Mount Carmel, he says, if the Lord be God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him. And You see Ahab saying, "You're the one, Elijah, that has troubled all Israel." People love to blame other people, don't they? And Ahab says, "You're my problem. I just need to get rid of you, Elijah." And Elijah, he's a brave man. He looks at the king and says, "I haven't troubled Israel. You have, because you have broken God's commandments." Because of disobedience to God's commandments in Elijah's day, judgments came. And now we have this nation that is leading the world to worship this first beast. Notice some of the things it does here. We already read verse 13, but let's read 13 and 14 together. He performs great signs so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men, and he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived. There's going to be deception here. There's going to be miracles, it says, and then deception. He's going to deceive the earth, those that dwell on the earth, by the signs that he does, saying that you need to make an image to this beast power. So what is this all about here? Well, when we look at it, we see that the United States, or what we should look, what is an image to the beast, first of all? What is an image? Well, if you say that it's an image, what is an image? It's a likeness of, right? So if it's a likeness of, this would be a likeness to this beast power. Now, what was this beast power? We've talked about this. We've seen it already. This is a major theme throughout Bible prophecy. This beast power combines, contrary to what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 22, verse 21, this beast power combines religion and the state together. We see it in Revelation 17. We're not there yet. We'll get there next weekend. But in Revelation chapter 17, there's a woman. What does a woman represent in Bible prophecy? A church, right? And there's a woman that's riding a beast. What does a beast represent? A kingdom, right? And so here we have a church that is riding the nation. Remember, the pure church in Revelation 12, she doesn't ride a beast. What does she stand on? The moon. She's standing upon the Word of God. But this false church that we'll look at in Revelation 17 is supported by the state. And by the way, if this woman is riding the beast, normally, not always, but normally, who is guiding and directing things? Normally it's the one that's, if you're riding a horse and you have the reins in your hands, you better hope you're guiding that horse, right? And so it's the woman here, it's the church that is calling the shots, that is directing the state. And this is exactly what happened during the Dark Ages. A church-state combination in which the church is telling the state what to do. We read a statement last night from Thomas Aquinas that a heretic, that is somebody that doesn't believe according to the church in their definition, a heretic does not deserve to be in the church, and they don't deserve to be on the earth. So what would they do? They would condemn him and then say, "Here you go, state, here you go, government, you need to kill him now." And the government would comply. Happened millions of times during the Dark Ages. And so when we see an image to the beast here in Revelation chapter 13, what we are seeing is a likeness of this first beast power, which was a combination of church and state. Now, when the church unites, church and state unite to enforce religious practices, this becomes a problem. Why do I say it's a problem? Well, we have another question we need to settle before we look at that some, and that is, how could this happen? How could church and state unite in the United States? I mean, we have a First Amendment, right? Guaranteeing freedom of press and assembly and freedom of religion. Well, what happened in Elijah's day? Well, in Elijah's day, the nation was going in disobedience to God's commandments. And God said, I've got to try to help them, and I'm going to allow judgments to come upon them to wake them up. And as these judgments came, instead it drove them further to Baal worship. Does the Bible, how could this happen? Well, we'll look at, just survey Revelation 18 real quick as well. Events surrounding this church-state union. Her sins have reached to heaven. She has lived luxuriously. She experiences natural disasters. You know, when disasters take place and when difficult times come, people, at least for a little bit, start turning to God, don't they? Do you remember in 9/11? In the last few decades, the weeks after 9/11, the churches were fuller than they'd ever been. Now, it only lasted about 4 weeks, they say. People have very short attention spans, too. But what happened, people began turning to God. Why? Because of this disaster, this calamity that had come. You can imagine if there are disasters that come, and whatever those disasters might be, I don't know, but disasters that come, just like in Elijah's day, and people start saying, we've got to get back to God. And as they try to get back to God, what does that mean? Well, I believe we do need to get back to God, but we can't force other people to worship and get back to God the way we do, right? We have to give freedom. That's what Jesus always gives, freedom. Judgments fall and her riches come to nothing. You can imagine there's disasters that come just like in Elijah's day, and then there's this, quote, great religious revival in which there's this chaos and people say, we've got to get back to God. We've got to unite the church with the state again, or whatever they're going to say. And there's miracles that take place. And as these miracles take place, it seems to lead people even further in this false revival. What takes place? Well, we read Revelation 13:13. We already read that. We read about how he performs great signs so that even fire comes down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men, similar to in Elijah's day. But the Constitution guarantees liberty and freedom, right? First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. But did you realize that even now, thoughts regarding this are changing? This principle, there were many states that would not, there were states that said they would not sign the Constitution until we had promise of a Bill of Rights. And so they promised to give a Bill of Rights, and those Bill of Rights did come. We have them, first 10 amendments, right? And Thomas Jefferson wrote that when he was asked by some Danbury Baptists, what about, how is this going to affect our faith? Because Baptists were persecuted at that time, and Baptists believed strongly in separation of church and state at that time because they were persecuted. And Thomas Jefferson wrote, the First Amendment sets a wall of separation between church and state. Now, many don't realize that Thomas Jefferson did not coin that phrase. Thomas Jefferson actually was going 200 years before to Roger Williams in Rhode Island, who talked about the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world and the hedge that needed to be between them. 200 years before, thereabouts, Roger Williams was recognizing what happens when church and state get together. At that time, they wrote books and pamphlets, and the titles were as long as the book themselves. So I don't even remember the whole title because it's like an enormous sentence. But the bloody tenet of persecution said every time that the church and state get together, what happens? Persecution starts. That's what happened to Roger Williams. They drove him out of Massachusetts Bay Colony because he had a little bit different beliefs. And these were things, you look at the first draft of the Bill of Rights, the first draft of the First Amendment, and it's much stronger than what it is then. Now, that wasn't passed, and it would hearken much further back to Roger Williams, where you have liberty of conscience. That's what Williams was standing for. And so these things were known. The founders recognized this, and they meant to establish that there. But times have changed, and people are recognizing that times are changing. The thinking is different. This is from a U.S. News and World Report several years ago. God and Country. New thinking about the role of faith in America. We've seen changes take place in this area. Supreme Court. Now, this is from several decades ago. Former Chief Justice William Rehnquist, notice what he said, the wall of separation between church and state is a metaphor based on bad history. Now, Chief Justice Rehnquist was a brilliant individual, but I would strongly disagree with him on that statement. Why? Because prophecy shows again and again that when church and state come together, guess what it does? Those that are in the majority, it's fine for them, but the minority, it becomes a major problem. You look at the beasts back in Daniel's day, these different kingdoms. Most of them were church-state combinations, and most of them resulted in persecution. In Daniel chapter 3, we have a church-state combination. And guess what happens? If you don't bow and worship this image, you're going to be thrown into a burning fiery furnace. When the church relies on the state, it is a problem. During the Dark Ages, church-state combination, what do you have? Millions of people that die because they have a Bible in their hands, because they're worshiping different from what the majority. And you can look, we still have lots of church-state combinations in the world today. Look at the Taliban. The Taliban was a church-state combination. Now it was a Muslim state, but it's still a church-state combination. And so you see instances over and over again throughout history that when you put them together, it causes persecution. And when we look at this, we see that's why Jesus said, render to God what is God, and to Caesar, render to Caesar what is Caesar, and to God what is God's. Notice the St. Louis Post-Dispatch said, as the second century of the Bill of Rights draws to a close, the Supreme Court is redefining what religious liberty will mean in the third century. Broadly, the court's new approach helps conventional religions while hurting unconventional ones. What does that mean? Well, it means that it's not truly religious freedom. It's religious freedom for the majority, which is what church-state combinations frequently have. George Washington said, let every man conducting himself as a good citizen and being accountable to God alone for his religious opinions ought to be protected in worshiping the deity according to the dictates of his own conscience. Benjamin Franklin, when religion is good, it will take care of itself. When it is not able to take care of itself, and God does not see fit to take care of it, so it will have to appeal to the civil power for support. It's evidence in my mind that the cause is a bad one. Ulysses S. Grant. Leave the matter of religion, teaching to the family altar, the church, and the private school supported entirely by private contributions. Keep the church and state forever separate. Notice we have consistency. We've just gone through, that was 100 years of time, basically, from Franklin to Grant, and they're consistent. The state should not support the teaching of religion. It only causes problems. Keep the church and state forever separate. Now, there's the amendment that guarantees the free exercise. People have an individual right to exercise their religion, whether they're in government or not. There's a free exercise clause there that is important as well. But you have to keep them separate, because if you don't, you start, and actually it hurts the church and it hurts everybody else as well. But you remember back in Revelation chapter 12, when we studied Revelation 12, verse 17, there is the final verse, Revelation 12:17. It says, then the dragon was enraged with the woman and went to make war with the rest of her offspring who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Elijah, in Elijah's day, was made the scapegoat of the problems that came upon the nation of Israel. Prophecy is suggesting that those that keep the commandments of God will be made or considered the scapegoat of bringing these judgments. And it's happened before. In early Christian times, they would worship. There would be local gods for the cities and the areas. And these local gods, they would require, if there was an earthquake, so, okay, there's an earthquake. That means the God is angry with us. We want everybody in our town to come and to do sacrifice to our God so that he won't be angry. And so they would come and they would bring and they would throw their incense into the altar and show that they are worshiping the city god or the provincial god or whatever it was. But Christians couldn't do that. And so the Christians were called, you know what Christians were called? Atheists. Because they didn't believe in the city god. They didn't believe in the God of the province, and they were persecuted. Why? Not for worshiping their God. They were persecuted because they did not worship the majority faith at the time. And we can also look in history. The devil wanted to unite people religiously. What vehicle might he use? When we studied about the attack of the Antichrist, the Roman Empire was divided, and as the Roman Empire, there's fractions taking place. Constantine, as a shrewd politician, was wanting to unite the empire. How was he going to do that? Well, in 321, he passed the first civil, that we know of at least, Sunday law, and tried to unite the pagans and the Christians together. Do you suppose the devil might do the same thing today? We've studied about the mark of the beast. We see that the mark of the beast, the mark that this beast power claims as its authority, is a change from Saturday, the Sabbath, from the Sabbath to Sunday. What better way than to unite Christians and non-Christians alike than to enforce a day of rest? And really, it sounds good, doesn't it? Who wouldn't want a day of rest? And perhaps the arguments might go that it would be good for families, and it'd be good for the environment. And all those things are good. We want families to do well. We want the environment to do well. All of that's good. But when it comes to enforcing a religious practice, we have church and state uniting, and it will for sure lead to persecution because it always has in history and contemporary times. And the Bible tells us, let's read it, Revelation 13, verses 15, 16, and 17. He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. He causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, and that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. What do we have the Bible predicting here? The Bible predicts that our country would be the final, basically, nation, final power of Bible prophecy. And that it would come and it would become a worldwide authority, which the United States exercises worldwide authority today, not territorially way, but through influence and through finances. And it would come, and we see that that has taken place from these few little colonies some 200 years ago to now exercising, having worldwide influence, and that it would lead the world to worship the first beast. And the first beast was this church-state combination of the Dark Ages, this papal power. And what would it do? It would do the same thing that the devil tried to do back 1,500 years ago, when the empire was fractured and there were disasters that were coming upon the empire, to try to unite the empire, what did it do? It brought about a Sunday law. And we find in Revelation chapter 13 that it says this power will lead the world to receive the mark of the beast, and whoever did not worship or did not receive this mark of the beast would not be able to buy or to sell, and would eventually not be able to live. It says they'd be killed even if they got their way. Could that happen? Back in the late 70s and early 80s, a movement formed, and notice what they say here. This is the Christian Coalition, Religious Right. Notice what they said. If Christians unite, we can do anything. We can pass any law or any amendment, and that's exactly what we intend to do. Very interesting. Now, there's nothing wrong with Christians that want to be involved, but Christians that are uniting to force their beliefs and their convictions on others is just as wrong as if it was Muslims or Buddhists or Hindus that were uniting to force their convictions and their beliefs on others. Notice what Christianity Today, this was right after the gas crisis, and Christianity Today, prominent magazine still today, all businesses, including gasoline stations and restaurants, should close every Sunday by force of legislative fiat. What does that mean? Forced through law, through the duly elected officials of the people. Do we have this now? No. But are people talking about it? Yes. Previous, I guess 2 popes back, John Paul II, encyclical letter, Dies Domini. Christians will naturally strive to ensure that civil legislation respects their duty to keep Sunday holy. What is this saying? The Pope was calling that Christians should try to push for legislative enactments. That's how a nation speaks, by the way, through legislative enactments, to keep Sunday holy. Now, if someone is convinced that they need to keep Sunday holy, that's not a problem. They should be able to do that. I disagree with it from the Bible. You know what my position is? That if we're going to follow the Bible, we need to keep the 10 Commandments and keep the Sabbath. But somebody has that right to do that. Just like they have a right, Muslims worship on Friday. They have a right to worship on Friday. I should not tell them that they cannot do that if that's what their religious conviction is. But here we find pushing and movement to have laws that enforce Sunday. Now, could this happen? What are we talking about? It already has happened, actually. 100 years ago, and even before then, if you go all the way back to Plymouth Bay Colony, Massachusetts Bay Colony, Plymouth Bay, that area, there were blue laws. We don't exactly know why they were called blue laws. Some say they were on blue paper or whatever. Some say because of the Puritans. But there were blue laws that enforced Sunday. And some of these blue laws, for example, one of them was, I remember one, that on Sunday it was against the law to kiss your child, because that'd be working on Sunday, I guess. And there were a number of other blue laws. And these laws, 100 years ago or so, there were people that were put in jail, and some actually died in jails because they were hoeing their garden on Sunday after they'd kept the Sabbath previously. People are still talking about it. Here's another one. She wrote a book, The Sabbath World, and she says she wants to keep Sundays timeless. In a world of 24/7 commerce, she's pushing for a return to laws that would shut down businesses one day a week. Time magazine. Maybe those old blue laws, that's Sunday laws, weren't so crazy after all. Has it happened yet? No. But are there those that are talking about it? Yes. The Bible predicts that this would happen, and we see developments in that direction. This year, Crisis Magazine, which is, you can see it there, it's a voice of faithful Catholic laity, and the article title is Bring Back the Blue Laws. Notice what it says. America, for the sake of its own emotional and spiritual welfare, for the sake of its own sanity, needs to restore the blue laws. That's Sunday closings. I am not advocating mandatory church-going, though it wouldn't be the worst idea, but rather simple restrictions on which businesses remain open on Sunday. Still something that's being talked about. Another statement from this year. This is from the Louisiana Baptist Message. Last week, as environmentalists, this was in May 1st, last week, as environmentalists around the world celebrated Earth Day, I was intrigued by the potential of a biblical solution to the problem of air pollution, a day of rest. As for the economic impact, businesses, from their being closed one day of the week, Chick-fil-A has done quite well by closing on Sundays. Different reasons people are talking about. But yet, it all is an inkling, maybe a rumbling, that we're living in times when prophecies are coming close to fulfillment. This was in the Arizona State Senate, not the U.S. Senate, Arizona State Senate, and the state senator there, Sylvia Allen, said this, a debate on the floor. Probably we should be debating a bill requiring every American to attend a church of their choice on Sunday to see if we can get back to having a moral rebirth. Disasters. We have our share of disasters, don't we? Perhaps more, I don't know. People uniting and clamoring and say, we got to get back to God, which I agree with. We need to get back to God, but we can't force people to. All we can do is extend an invitation for them to get back to God. And then pushing legislators to enact laws to unite, to solve these problems by enforcing a tradition of man of Sunday worship. The Bible predicted that the beast power would arise and claim to change times, intend to change times among. We saw that last night. This power has arisen and done exactly that. The Bible predicts that this would be the mark of its authority, and we see that it claims this mark as a sign of its authority. And then the Bible predicts that another nation would arise, promising liberty and freedom, but would do the opposite and speak like a dragon and lead the world to worship this first beast and to receive what the Bible refers to as the mark of the beast. And it identifies it primarily through economic power, which is the influence of the United States, economic power. Could the United States really lead the world to honor, even if it didn't say it was doing it this way, to honor this first beast by enforcing Sunday closings and Sunday worship? Well, go to Egypt. Guess what day the banks and businesses are closed on Egypt, this Muslim country? Go to Turkey, another Islamic, secular Islamic country. Because of the banking ties to Europe and the Western world, even though Friday is the Islamic day of worship, Sunday is when they're closed. Go over to India, Hindu country. Sunday, because of the economic ties, is when they're closed. Go over to Japan, secular Buddhist country. Sunday is the day they're closed. Around the world, it doesn't matter the religion of the country. Around the world, because of economic ties, we see a preference for the first day. I don't believe it's a stretch at all to say. I believe on the authority of Bible prophecy, we can say that this is what God has predicted. All of the other prophecies have taken place, and we see that the United States has arisen, and as the United States has arisen, it has fulfilled the marks of this power, and that it will lead the world to this church-state union, which will force the worship or the honoring to the papal system by recognizing the first day of the week. How could this be enforced? It's not hard. Have you ever tried to go to a store and they said, please bring exact change or use a credit card? Yeah, maybe that's just a little thing. I remember one time some years ago I was trying to pay. We were holding some meetings in a hotel, and I was trying to pay with a checking check. And so we went to pay, and they ran through their little check thing, the whatever thing that scans it. They said, oh, we're sorry, we can't accept this check. I'm like, there's money there. What's the problem? I called the bank, and the bank said, yeah, there's money there. The bank said, we'll talk to them. There's money there. Nope, we can't accept it. Economic activity is controlled. Now, that's not the mark of the beast, not the control of economic activity. That's not the mark of the beast, but it's a way that it could be enforced around the world. The Bible predicts that God will have a people that will stand for God, even in trials and difficult times. Revelation 14, verse 12, we're studying Revelation tonight. But Revelation 14, 12, here is the patience of the saints. Here are those who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. God is calling us to be among the people that keep His commandments and have the faith of Jesus. Acts chapter 5, verse 29, but Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. God calls us to obey God, to put Him first, to obey God rather than man. We have a crisis coming on this world similar to in the days of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Prophecy has predicted it. Prophecy has been accurate on everything else. I believe it will be accurate on this as well. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were brought before this golden image. And as they're brought before this golden image, all the people around them are falling down and worshiping this image. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stand firm for God. I believe God is calling us to be Shadrachs, Meshachs, and Abednegos today. To say we ought to obey God rather than man. We're going to put God first. We're going to keep His commandments. We're going to follow His leading because God, we're going to render to Caesar what is Caesar, yes, but we're going to render to God what is God's. Was God with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? He helped them. Will God be with us as well? Yeah. Was God with Elijah? God was with Elijah. He'll be with us as well. But we have to choose and we have to determine that we're going to follow God no matter what. That we're going to stand for Him and His word. That we're not going to be preparing even inadvertently for the mark of the beast. We're going to be standing in obedience to Jesus and His commandments, including His Sabbath, even today. And I ask you, will you determine to stand faithfully for Jesus today, even as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did? Do you want to stand firmly and faithfully for Jesus today? I want to invite you to stand and say, yes, I want to stand firmly for Jesus today, as did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Let us stand together and say, Lord, we want to stand for you, just as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. Let us pray. Father in heaven, we thank you. We thank you for the promise of your word that you will never leave us nor forsake us. We trust in you. Please help us to be among those people described in Revelation that keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus. We pray that you will give us your strength and your courage to follow you fully. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.